For nearly 200 years, up until 1871, the British Army allowed officers to buy their commissions and promotions. Wealth, not merit, determined who commanded regiments. In 1836, James Brodnell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan, paid £35,000, over £3 million in today's money, to become Lieutenant Colonel of the 11th Hussars. He had never commanded men in battle. He'd never studied military tactics at any college. He had simply purchased his way from entry-level cornet to Lieutenant Colonel in just 6 years. 18 years later, at Balaclava, Cardigan would lead the charge of the Light Brigade into the Russian guns, one of the most infamous military blunders in British history. In the film Zulu, Lieutenant Chard cuttingly remarks to Lieutenant Bromhead,
"What military genius thought up that one? Somebody's son and heir? Got a commission before he learned to share."
To many, that sums up the purchase system, where teenage aristocrats become officers without any training, any experience, or any brains. But how accurate is that? This is the story of the purchase system, how it worked, why it existed, and the extraordinary men it produced, from the Duke of Wellington to the catastrophic Lord Cardigan. And you'll discover why the system that gave us the charge of the Light Brigade also kept Britain safe from military dictatorship for 200 years. The purchase system had its roots in medieval military practice. Mercenary captains in the 14th century invested in raising and training companies of soldiers, much like a trade guild. They could then sell their share when they retired. But the real origin of the formal purchase system in the British Army came in the 1660s, with the restoration of Charles II. England had just lived through a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. During the English Civil War, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, Parliament's new model army had been devastatingly effective. It had defeated the Royalists and executed Charles I in 1649. And then Cromwell used the same professional army to dissolve Parliament in 1653. For the next 7 years, England was ruled by Cromwell through his major generals. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, he faced a dilemma. England needed a standing army to face its enemies in Europe, not least the Dutch. But both political factions in England feared what a professional standing army could do. The Tories remembered how the new model army had executed the king and brought a revolution and military government. Meanwhile, their opponents, the Whigs, feared a standing army would become an instrument of royal tyranny, allowing the monarch to govern without Parliament. So both sides, despite hating each other, agreed on one thing: never again should England have a professional army that could become a law unto itself and threaten political stability. The purchase system, formally established by royal warrant on the 7th of March 1684, was the solution. The logic behind purchase rested on 5 key assumptions. First, officers who'd invested thousands of pounds in their commissions would never support revolution or military coups. They had too much to lose. An officer who'd spent, say, £7,000 on his lieutenant colonelcy would protect the property rights and political stability that safeguarded his investment. As late as the 1850s, the Duke of Wellington defended the system, stating that it brings into the service men of fortune and character, men who have some connection with the interests and fortunes of the country. Second, the commission itself served as a collateral for good behaviour. If an officer was court-martialled for cowardice, desertion or serious misconduct, he would forfeit his commission. He risked everything. Third, wealthy officers wouldn't need to steal. In many European armies, officers supplemented inadequate pay through corruption, embezzling their soldiers' wages, or allowing their troops to pillage civilians. A gentleman with substantial private income had no need for such practices. Fourth, the system was self-financing. When an officer retired, he sold his commission and recovered his investment. The government didn't need to fund pensions. The officer corps paid for itself. Fifth, it maintained social order. Officers drawn from the landed gentry would share the values of the governing class. They would support, not threaten, the existing social and political hierarchy. And crucially, their army pay was deliberately kept low, treated as little more than an honorarium. Officers then relied on private income from their estates and investments for their livelihood. This means they had no financial dependence on the army itself. If the military attempted to seize power, it would likely disrupt their other sources of income. They had no financial incentive to support a coup. A young man seeking a commission had to be at least 16 years old. He would purchase a commission, an ensign's commission in an infantry regiment, or a cornet's commission in a cavalry regiment. This was his entry point. The official regulated prices in the mid-19th century were for infantry regiments, ensigns £450 in those days money, lieutenants £700, captains £1,800, majors £3,500, and lieutenant colonels £6,000 to £9,000 depending on the regiment. And these prices varied significantly by regiment. A commission, for instance, in the Life Guards or the Royal Horse Guards could be 2 to 3 times the price of an ordinary infantry regiment. Promotion worked through a combination of purchase and seniority. When a vacancy occurred, the next officer in line had first refusal to purchase it. If he couldn't afford it or didn't want it, the opportunity passed to the next in seniority, and so on down the line. This created a domino effect. When one officer purchased the next rank up, it freed his old commission for someone else to buy, which then freed another commission, and so on and so on. So a single retirement at the very top could create opportunities cascading down through the entire regiment. But the official system was undermined by what everyone knew but the government officially denied: over-regulation prices, what we might call today a bung. This was paid on top of the official price of the commission to the seller. Officers routinely paid far more than the regulated prices through private arrangements. And these premiums were negotiated between the selling and buying officers, often through an agent. Edward Cooper Hodge, who commanded the 4th Dragoon Guards during the Crimean War, estimated that he had spent over £9,000 in total to get to his command, about £950,000 in today's money. Nearly half of that comprised over-regulated prices. Prices also fluctuated based on where a regiment was stationed. A commission in a regiment heading to, say, India or the Caribbean, where disease killed officers regularly, cost less than a commission in a regiment with a safe posting in England or Ireland. Thus it was common for officers to sell a commission in a regiment heading off to the tropics, and then purchase a similar rank in a regiment staying in, say, Hampshire. Possibly it ended up costing the officer financially, but then what's the price of avoiding death from malaria, dysentery or yellow fever? But purchase wasn't the only route to promotion, although it was the most common. An alternative was promotion for gallantry. Officers who distinguished themselves in battle could receive brevet promotions, advancing in rank without actually paying for it. And this led to officers deliberately seeking out dangerous postings and battles to get noticed. Some officers transferred between regiments multiple times, chasing action wherever it could be found. Staff appointments offered another route. Also, officers appointed as aides-de-camp to generals or to members of the royal family, or indeed staff positions at horse guards, could gain promotion without purchase, although this required a bit of patronage and connections. Or you could gain promotion simply by having a patron, a general or member of the royal family who took a liking to a young officer and could smooth their path considerably. So careers often ended up being a combination of purchases and non-purchases. Having said that, there were several notable examples, and we're coming to them in a moment, of officers who purchased every promotion to lieutenant colonel, and likewise some who never purchased a single promotion. General Garnet Wolseley is an example of the latter. He was given his initial commission free of charge after lobbying the Duke of Wellington and Lord Raglan, and was then promoted for gallantry and so on all the way up the ladder. Another option was Sandhurst. The Royal Military College at Sandhurst opened in 1802 and moved to its current location in 1812. But attending was not obligatory for officers. More importantly, graduating from Sandhurst did not guarantee a free commission. Of the 650 cadets who passed out of the college between 1838 and 1848, only 350, about half, gained free commissions. Indeed, in the early decades, the college struggled to fill its places, because families had to weigh up whether it was better to spend money on 2 years of military education that might not result in a commission, or simply pay for the commission directly and skip the training, and many chose the latter. And now this is where our story gets really interesting, because whilst the cavalry and infantry officers were buying their way up, there was an entire branch of the army that never touched the purchase system, and they produced some of Britain's finest commanders. The Royal Artillery and Royal Engineers never used the purchase system. From the 18th century onwards, their officers were commissioned purely on merit, selected through competitive examinations and promoted strictly by seniority. So why the difference? Well, from 1716 until 1855, the artillery and engineers weren't technically part of the army at all. They were administered by a completely separate government department, the Board of Ordnance. This ancient institution, dating back to the Middle Ages, was the second largest government department at the time after the Treasury. The reason was simple: technical competence. Artillery officers needed to understand ballistics, calculate trajectories, and manage gunpowder safely. Engineer officers needed to design fortifications, conduct sieges, build bridges, and survey terrain. And you couldn't buy technical expertise. More cynically, the equipment was too valuable too. Cannons cost thousands of pounds, fortifications represented enormous capital investments. The Board of Ordnance couldn't trust expensive military hardware to incompetent, wealthy amateurs. From 1741, the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, nicknamed the Shop, produced highly educated artillery and engineer officers who passed rigorous competitive examinations in mathematics, sciences and languages. They were selected by order of merit. Artillery and engineer officers were often looked down on as not quite gentlemen by cavalry and infantry officers who purchased their commissions. They were tainted by having to pass exams and by actually knowing what they were doing. The irony is delicious, because some of the most professionally competent officers in the British Army were sneered at as social inferiors. Two outstanding Victorian generals, Horatio Herbert Kitchener and Charles Gordon, were both Royal Engineers. And just for the record, the Royal Navy operated similarly, with promotion by examination and seniority rather than purchase, for identical reasons: technical competence and expensive ships. But even that meritocratic system had its own problems. Promotion purely by seniority created dead men's shoes. As an example, Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers, officer commanding at the defence of Rorke's Drift in the Zulu War, had been stuck as a lieutenant for nearly 11 years. There was one more exception worth noting. The East India Company Army operated its own military college at Addiscombe in Surrey, and the purchase system was not used. Two outstanding generals of the Victorian period, Robert Napier and Frederick Roberts, were graduates of this system. Before we look at some of the worst examples of the purchase system gone wrong, we need to address several myths about the system. Myth 1. All officer ranks were purchased. Wrong. Purchase only went up to Lieutenant Colonel of a regiment. Beyond that, promotion to Major General, Lieutenant General and General was based on seniority and brevet promotions. You couldn't buy your way to Field Marshal in the British Army. Myth 2. The officer class was reserved for the aristocracy. Wrong. While elite regiments like the Guards were dominated by aristocrats, other regiments had substantial numbers of middle-class officers. Sons of clergy, doctors and military families filled the ranks. Several notable non-aristocratic officers went all the way to the top in the purchase era. Sir Colin Campbell, who commanded the Thin Red Line at the Battle of Balaclava and relieved Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny, was the son of a Glasgow cabinet maker. Sir Garnet Wolseley was the son of a former officer turned shopkeeper. Meanwhile, Sir Henry Havelock, whose father was a shipbuilder, came from new money, not the aristocracy. When the 32nd Regiment of Foot embarked for India in 1846, its officers included 3 sons of landowners, 8 sons of officers and former officers, and 14 of varied middle-class occupations, including sons of a bishop, 2 clergymen, a judge, an East India Company civil servant, a colonial administrator, a Canadian businessman, a city merchant, a West Indian merchant, and a bank manager. When the regiment earned its place in the military pantheon by defending Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny, it included 3 officers promoted from the ranks, or rankers as they were called: William Rudman, John Langram, and John Giddings. Throughout the late 18th and 19th centuries, the social origins of those who finished up in the officers' mess was far less stereotypical than might be supposed. And whilst for some aristocratic families purchasing commissions was no big deal, for many of these sons of the middle class, they represented a significant financial commitment. Myth 3. Purchase prevented promotions from the ranks. Wrong again. Men could be commissioned from the ranks for exceptional bravery. We've just met 3 of them at Lucknow. In my recent story about the Battle of Seringapatam in India in 1799, Sergeant Graham was offered a commission as a reward for leading the Forlorn Hope to storm the breach. Famously, he died having achieved his goal, shouting, "Lieutenant Graham!" And during the Napoleonic Wars, numerous sergeants received commissions for bravery. Here are 2 examples. Joseph Barra, born in Sussex in 1780, enlisted first in the Warwickshire Militia and then in the 11th Dragoons. He was a sergeant by 1804, and in 1807 he was commissioned without purchase into the 16th Light Dragoons, gaining a further non-purchase lieutenancy in 1808 and a non-purchase captaincy in 1815. John Shipp had an even more interesting career. He was raised as an orphan by his parish and enlisted in the 22nd Foot in 1797. He eventually became a sergeant and went to India, where during Lord Lake's fruitless and costly siege of Bhurtpore in 1805, he volunteered for repeated storming parties and was commissioned without purchase into the 65th Regiment. There, he recalled, "All the officers of the corps flocked round me and greeted me in the most handsome and friendly manner. Had I been the son of a duke, my reception could not have been more flattering or friendly." He moved with another unpaid promotion to the rank of lieutenant to the 76th Regiment just 3 weeks later, and after his return to England, he was, in consideration for his distinguished services in the field, allowed to sell his commission to pay his debts, even though non-purchase commissions could not normally be sold. But Shipp's story doesn't end there. He then re-enlisted in the 24th Dragoons and had reached the rank of Sergeant Major before he was again commissioned from the ranks, this time into the 87th Foot. Interestingly, and it might come as a bit of a shock to my Richard Sharp fans here, many ordinary soldiers didn't like officers being promoted from the ranks, possibly because they knew the inside track and could tell when their men were malingering. But what was true was that ranker officers without private means struggled to purchase any further promotions, and also struggled to afford the lifestyle expected of officers and gentlemen. But then, this remained a problem even after the purchase system was abolished. Myth 4. The system produced a succession of incompetent idiots at the top of the army. Well, there were certainly incompetent purchased officers, such as Lord Dunkellin, a captain in the Grenadier Guards. During the Crimean War, he and his men were some way from the British lines when a party of mounted men appeared. Despite his men warning him that they were Russians, the aristocrat announced, "Nonsense, they're our fellows," and trotted off to greet them, where he was promptly taken prisoner. But for each of these liabilities, There were also many highly successful commanders who'd also purchased their early promotions. And the most notable example? Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington, or Wellesley as he was then, purchased his ensign's commission in the 73rd Highlanders in 1787, aged 18. He then purchased his way up rapidly, lieutenant a year later in 1788, captain in 1791, major in 1793, and later that year, lieutenant colonel of the 33rd Regiment, aged just 24. When he took command of the 33rd, Wellington had never commanded troops in battle. He'd received no formal military training. He learnt his whole trade on the job. His first action was at Boxtel in Flanders in 1794. Then came the campaigns in India, where he made his reputation. And finally, the Peninsular War, and then ultimately Waterloo. Similarly, General Viscount Hugh Gough purchased his early commissions and went on to command successfully in India in the Anglo-Sikh Wars and in China. And then there was Sir Harry Smith, who fought throughout the Peninsular War and later governed the Cape Colony, and benefited from purchases in his early career. And Generals Sir Colin Campbell and Sir Garnet Wolseley have already been mentioned. So the system could produce both excellence and incompetence. And here comes possibly the poster boy for incompetence. James Brudnell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. Cardigan purchased his cornet's commission in the 8th Hussars in 1824, and by 1830, just 6 years later, he'd purchased his way to Lieutenant Colonel of the 15th Hussars, all without ever seeing any action. He was forced to sell that command after a series of scandals involving his treatment of officers. But in 1836, he purchased the Lieutenant Colonelcy of the 11th Hussars for approximately £35,000, which is over £3 million in today's money. And again, still no combat experience, just wealth. His career with the 11th Hussars was marked by incompetence, arrogance and absurdity. He once placed an officer under arrest for putting a bottle of Moselle wine on the mess table instead of champagne. He fought duels with his own officers. He was obsessed with uniforms and parade ground drill, whilst ignorant of tactics. When the Crimean War came in 1854, Cardigan commanded the Light Brigade of Cavalry. However, rather than camping with his men, he stayed on his yacht with his mistress. On the 25th of October 1854 at Balaclava, he led 673 men in a charge directly into the Russian artillery, the charge of the Light Brigade. The charge of the Light Brigade was a disaster caused by multiple failures of command, but Cardigan's incompetence contributed significantly. Cardigan exemplified everything wrong with the purchase system. A wealthy aristocrat commanding men in battle despite having no aptitude, no training and no business being anywhere near a regiment. The Crimean War laid bare the failures of the British military system. Cardigan was just one example. The Times correspondent, William Howard Russell, sent dispatches describing the chaos, incompetence and suffering. The British public were shocked. The army's administrative systems were antiquated. Supply broke down catastrophically, and more men died of disease and cold than from enemy action. Many senior officers proved incapable of handling modern warfare. Now, purchase wasn't the only problem, but it became symbolic of everything outdated about the army. And then in 1870, Prussia defeated France in the Franco-Prussian War in just 6 weeks. The Prussian army, with its professional officer corps trained at staff colleges, universal conscription and modern organisation, demonstrated the future of warfare. The gentleman amateur suddenly looked not just outdated, but dangerous. Liberal politicians, led by Prime Minister William Gladstone, saw purchase as part of a broader problem. Aristocratic privilege blocking merit in British institutions. The civil service had been reformed in 1854 to require competitive examinations. Why should the army be any different? Edward Cardwell, Gladstone's Secretary of State for War, pushed for comprehensive reforms in the army, including abolishing the purchase system. Opposition was fierce. Conservative politicians defended tradition. Senior officers, led by the Duke of Cambridge, the Commander-in-Chief of the Army himself, fought the reforms. Cambridge actually believed the system worked. Many serving officers saw their commissions as pension funds. They'd invested their capital, expecting to recover it on retirement. Abolishing purchase without compensation would ruin them and their families. The government agreed to compensate the officers. This was expensive and controversial, but necessary, because the House of Lords was prepared to still block the abolition. Cardwell and Gladstone found a solution. The purchase system rested on a royal warrant issued by Charles II in 1684, not on an Act of Parliament. And what one monarch had created, another could abolish. On the 20th of July 1871, Queen Victoria issued a royal warrant abolishing purchase. The Lords were bypassed, and after 187 years, purchase was ended by royal decree. The abolition triggered a mad rush. Officers scrambled to purchase the last commissions available before the system ended in November 1871, and their future promotions would, well then, depend on, well, their actual abilities to command. One officer who bought his lieutenancy in October 1871, just 1 month before abolition, was Gonville Bromhead of the 24th Regiment of Foot. And interestingly, by the time he fought at Rorke's Drift in January 1879, he was still a lieutenant. Enough said. Abolition required all new infantry and cavalry officers to attend Sandhurst. This was now mandatory, not optional. But the new system filtered through slowly. Based on typical attrition rates and new entrants coming in, the majority of officers in the army were still products of the purchase system until the late 1880s or early 1890s. During the Second Boer War in 1899 to 1902, some senior officers were still purchase-era veterans. General Sir Edward Buller, for example, had entered the army in 1858 and purchased his early commissions. By the First World War, however, the transformation was complete. The original commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, had passed out of Sandhurst in 1874, 3 years after purchase. Field Marshal Haig passed out in 1884, and Generals Rawlinson and Allenby had also attended Sandhurst in the 1880s. The Cardwell reforms didn't fundamentally change the class composition of the officer corps. Even without purchase, the financial barriers remained. Officers needed private income for expensive uniforms, mess bills, and maintaining the expected lifestyle of a gentleman. Educational qualifications for Sandhurst favoured public schools and universities. Experience in cadet forces helped, which again favoured the wealthy from those schools and universities. Working-class rankers promoted to officer found the social expectations difficult. Some, like Colour Sergeant Bourne, one of the defenders at Rorke's Drift, initially refused a commission because he feared he couldn't afford the officer lifestyle. Thus, the gentleman officer culture persisted. Between 1871 and 1914, the British Army Officer Corps remained overwhelmingly upper and upper middle class, although maybe not as aristocratic as you might think. By 1899, according to historian Richard Holmes, just 12% of officers came from long-established aristocratic families, the same proportion as coming from clergy families. It wasn't until the Second World War that the British Army truly benefited from something approaching a modern meritocracy. From a modern standpoint, the purchase system can be seen as elitist and amateur. Cardigan and the whole Crimean War seem to epitomise that. And yet, for every Cardigan, it also produced a Wellesley. We tend to forget that some of Britain's greatest victories at Blenheim, Minden, Quebec, Salamanca, Vittoria, Waterloo were delivered by rafts of officers, very much part of the purchase system. Yes, it certainly produced a lot of incompetent commanders and battlefield disasters, but then the British Army has managed a fair few of those since abolition of purchase too. Just ask General Percival at Singapore in 1942. By the mid-19th century, the system was no longer fit for purpose. The long period of peace after the Napoleonic Wars had managed to hide the fact that simply buying a command with absolutely no training or examination was just not out of touch and amateur, but downright dangerous in a rapidly modernising world of professional industrial warfare. It needed the Crimean War to highlight that fact. What people also forget about the purchase system is that elitism per se was never its purpose. It was sanctioned back in the 1680s to prevent another Cromwell-style military dictatorship. And whilst the solution might seem a bit bizarre in the 21st century, it actually did its job. For 200 years, the army never attempted to seize power, unlike in France under Napoleon, nor was a monarch ever able to use it to establish autocratic rule. So, in a way, the purchase system was actually part of Britain's journey towards a modern parliamentary democracy. If you enjoyed learning about the purchase system, then check out my episode on the Duke of Wellington's first independent command at the Battle of Versailles in 1803, where the man who purchased his way all the way to Lieutenant Colonel proved his worth in India. Or perhaps you'd like the story of Colour Sergeant Bourne, who turned down a commission after Rorke's Drift. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more forgotten stories from British history with you very soon.